Conservative religious groups have been launching campaigns to cleanse libraries of books they consider objectionable.
For 18 years, Norma and Mel Gabler have been fighting the battle of the textbooks.
Who runs our schools? It's a question that's concerning more and more parents all over the country. People who feel that the schools are responsible for declining moral standards, a decline in patriotism, that the schools are challenging, even threatening traditional family ties.
You just heard the voices of 60 Minutes correspondents Ed Bradley, Mike Wallace, and Morley Safer. For almost 50 years, 60 Minutes has been documenting conflict in America's classrooms, fights over what kids should be allowed to read. And what you're about to hear from 1975 sounds a lot like today.
Parents are beginning to examine their school boards, the teachers, the curricula, and most of all, the textbooks that their children are reading.
Morley Safer had returned from covering the war in Vietnam to find a different sort of war brewing in America.
Nowhere in the country is that scrutiny more intense than in Kanawha County, Charleston, West Virginia, where it's come to be known as the Battle of the Textbooks.
Over the course of the last year, our podcast team at 60 Minutes has been sifting through hundreds of hours of film reels and tapes.
This was Morley's textbook story.
I love it. They have boxes, cardboard boxes, and old tattered papers and files.
I mean, some of them are absolutely falling apart.
To uncover some of the surprising ways stories of the past connect to our present, and to give those stories a second look. It was particularly worthwhile in this case. Morley Safer had set out to report on one of the earliest, most violent episodes in what we now call the culture wars. And if you think education politics of today are contentious.
In 1974, teachers had to leave at the end of a day and check under the hood to make sure that there weren't any bombs there.
There were neighbors that turned against neighbors, families that turned against families. You were either for the books or against the books. And it was almost like a civil war.
You'll hear in this episode how a playbook formulated in the 1970s became a sort of blueprint for modern conservative activism.
When two people demanded the banning of 97 books, Buford found itself in a battle over the true meaning of liberty.
It was ever thus. Everything old is new again. I can keep going with the cliches, but we've been here before.
It might surprise you just what can be learned by revisiting that textbook fight in West Virginia 50 years later.
You can really draw a bright red line from 74 to 2024.
This is 60 Minutes, A Second Look, and I'm your host, Seth Doan. I'm a senior foreign correspondent for CBS News and Sunday Morning, and have been a fan of 60 Minutes for as long as I can remember. 60 Minutes, A Second Look will go inside our vast archive. Thousands of stories dating back more than 55 years to 1968. We'll reveal surprising moments that were never broadcast, and in the process uncover details even more compelling with the context of time. Today, book banning's early chapter.
Hi, Marion. Hi, Cece.
How you doing?
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Could you each first just start with a little introduction?
Okay, I'm Cece Brown, and I live here in Charleston, West Virginia, and actually I'm a retired social worker.
And I'm Marion Alston. I'm a resident here in Kanawha Valley.
Cece Brown and Marion Alston have been friends since their sons were in kindergarten together. They clearly make each other laugh.
No, I don't. This is the first time I've ever met him.
Yeah, I don't know.
They live in the heart of Appalachia, nestled amid pastoral fields and mountains.
First of all, could you just say the name of this county? Because there seems to be different ways of pronouncing it.
She pronounces it Kanawha, and I pronounce it Kanawha.
Kanawha. Yeah. Well, that's probably my southern accent.
No. So if you go either Kanawha or Kanawha.
Yeah. So
this is making it very difficult for me. I'm going to have to pick sides as to what how I pronounce it.
That's what wars are all about.
Now you're all in the middle of it.
Yes.
In the 1970s, Brown was in high school, and Alston was one of just a few black teachers in Kanawha County.
So you were really right in the middle of all this.
Well, we both were. Cece as a student, Myself as a teacher, when I watched the 60-minute story, it brought back memories.
Most of the nation's public school children return to school next week. And this year, as in the past few years, the students in a number of communities will be in the center of a deep controversy, one that runs deeper even than the issue of busing, and that is, who's in charge? Who runs our schools?
It all started with a routine Kanawha County School Board meeting in April of 1974. On the agenda was a plan to add 325 new books to the curriculum.
It was this high school English teacher, Nellie Wood, who recommended the adoption of the new textbooks. Mrs. Wood feels that as valuable as old-time education might seem to be, it in no way prepares people for this, let alone the next century.
Our whole concept of what is important has had to change in order for us to survive. And so what we must develop in students are techniques to handle problems, skills or tools, if you will, with which to deal with the problems of life.
A committee of educators had spent nearly a year selecting books for classrooms and libraries that would satisfy recent state requirements to make the material students learned more, quote, multi-ethnic and multicultural.
To anyone who went through public education 30 or 40 years ago, the books are certainly different. Throughout, they try to be relevant. So Lily White's stories of one's childhood now show black faces. Fantasy worlds are replaced with the realities of urban America.
But not everyone thought this change was progress.
Values and attitudes expressed by certain writers, black and white, that might be acceptable in certain pockets of America are shocking, profane, dangerous, and revolutionary in vast stretches of this country, and certainly not relevant, safe, or acceptable to this woman, Mrs. Alice Moore, member of the Kanawha County School Board.
She was a person who most people remember in association with the textbook controversy.
This again is Marion Alston, who grew up in Kanawha County. Like a lot of people there, she remembers Alice Moore as a public figure in the community. Moore was a middle-class white woman in her 30s who had run for county school board on an anti-sex education platform. Her slogan was, "We need a mother on the school board."
She's a lady who was very genteel and who was very impressive. She was the wife of an evangelical minister in a church that was very well established. She was a perfect person to lead this movement. Her first objections to the books were that the urban dialect was being used.
Let me ask you, how did you interpret urban dialect?
For those of us that had grown up in the civil rights movement, we knew exactly what that meant. It meant black authors.
But Moore's critiques did not stop there. Here she is responding to Morley Safer.
What do you find so objectionable?
For instance, 7th grade book dealing with a boy's, or 3 or 4 boys' first trip to a prostitute. Another 7th grade book that deals with 15-year-old boy and his girlfriend. She gets pregnant. He steals money from his father to get an abortion for the girl.
Moore argued there were certain subjects that should stay out of the classroom.
I think what we're going to have to do in public education, if it's to continue to survive, is to make the schools go back to teaching of the basic skills to students and stay out of the areas of opinion, stay out of the moral questions, stay out of the parent-child relationship, stay out of the psychoanalyzing of children in the classroom, get back to teaching children reading and writing and arithmetic when the schools are doing a pathetic job at that these days.
In 1974, the dynamic of the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, in turn created confusion among people who were still trying to adjust to all that fast, furious stuff that went on in the 60s. The timing was perfect for ideas to clash. But what lit the torch was Alice Moore stoking the fears and the prejudices of folks and the biases.
Alice Moore never found a receptive audience within the school board, but she did not have to look far beyond it for allies. Within a month, Moore had garnered support from more than 24 fundamentalist ministers in the area.
They're calling evil good now, and they're calling good evil. My, when a nation the Bible says forgets God, it'll be turned into hell.
They used their churches to organize a network of protesters against the textbooks.
We don't need weak-kneed preachers and weak-kneed teachers that'll teach evil things in our schools. We need people that'll stand up for our almighty God and teach our children right.
Mrs. Moore drew considerable support from business and professional people like Elmer Fike, head of a chemical company, a Republican county chairman. He collected enough four-letter words in the textbooks to fill a full-page newspaper ad.
So you can see it's a full page.
The title is What Your Children Will Read, ...
Yeah, there's line after line after line.
That's 60 Minutes podcast producer Julie Holstein. She's showing me via Zoom a yellowing page of the Charleston Gazette from 1974, which she found in the original 60 Minutes story files. Don't be misled, ! These excerpts are in your children's books, and then it lists offensive language, words, etc.
Damn it, good God, I've never met a bastard like you before, go to hell, for Christ's sake.
Morley held this clipping up during the story.
Yes, he held it up in his interview with Elmer Fike, the gentleman who had taken out the ad in the newspaper.
You've got to admit that when you took out this ad, what your children will read, that you're highly selective. You took almost everything out of context.
This charge is made all the time. It's taken out of context. The sad thing about it is that the more you read the books, the more depressing they are. It's really only when you look at them and read them in context that you really get the full impact.
There were a wide range of books in question.
A new version of The Three Little Pigs that shows blood on the wolf's paws. Too graphic, say the critics. Educational, say defenders. It shows the result of violence. And also on the list are works by Arthur Miller, Mark Twain's War Prayer, and selections from militant black writers, Eldridge Cleaver, Langston Hughes, and James Baldwin. Reflections of America, say defenders. Advocate social change, not the job of the schools, say the critics.
I think that a school system must respect minority groups, and we've done that very well with the black community. We've done it well with the Jewish and many other communities. We have been very careful to take out anything that offends those groups, and I think we should. But I think we should also take out things which offend other groups, whether they're minorities or majorities. And I think we ought to take out things that offend people in the Bible Belt.
When you bring God in the picture, it's either good or it's evil. And if it's evil, you're terrible. And I was for the books.
C.C. Brown was just finishing her junior year of high school when the new books sparked the protests. And as a precocious teenager, she wanted to understand what the debate was all about.
I remember I was, 16, 17, 16, I think. And they had a rally at the ball field. And I remember riding my bike up to the park because I was curious and I wanted to find out, why are these books bad? Why do you think that? And there was a lady who was handing out flyers, and one of the flyers had a poem from Langston Hughes. And I said to this woman, why is this bad? This is his perspective. And shouldn't we know other people's perspective? Shouldn't we understand where other people are coming from? Oh no, this is a terrible poem, this is terrible.
Do you remember what was controversial about it?
What was controversial, it was about, they were talking badly about, the police. And they called it, ghetto language.
As Marion Alston and C.C. Brown remember it, the book banning campaign was about much more than morality and the school's failure to teach the basics of reading and writing.
The books were dirty, filthy, and un-American. Well, that was a code for too black, too Jewish, and too gay.
You could see through it that it was about culture and race. I could see through it. The things that I saw, and I was just, 16? I was a young kid.
As the summer wore on, rallies and protests spread. By the beginning of the school year, as Morley Safer noted, what started as a fight had turned into a brawl.
They formed into vigilante groups, demanding entry to Kanawha County schools to inspect the library shelves. They staged protests outside courthouses and burned red flags. They used all the tactics of the militant left, of the students of the 60s, of civil rights protesters and the peace movement. And the women called the coal miners out to picket against the offending books.
What happened is the book protesters began to stop the buses. They went to the bus garages and blocked them, and they picketed. And so there were many days we couldn't get to school.
There are 46,000 children to be educated in the Kanawha County school system. It's debatable what effect the textbooks might or might not have had on them, but the textbook fight had a profound effect. Many of them lost as much as 3 months of school, kept out by parents for fear of violence. Others kept out for fear of indoctrination.
For people who were on a day-to-day basis having to deal with protesters, it was really bad. For those folks that were on the front lines, it was horrific. My mother was a teacher. My mother had to be escorted to school every day by state police.
Why was she escorted?
Because there were guns, snipers, shots were taken at police cars, places of business. They not only picketed the businesses, but it would turn into violence, where gunshots would go off, folks would be beat up. Teachers had to leave at the end of a day and check under the hood to make sure that there weren't any bombs there.
I remember waking up one morning and hearing this loud noise and finding out the school had been bombed.
Daytime, this schoolyard rang with children's voices. But late one night, dynamite went off. A classroom was destroyed.
You know, it was all torn up inside and the windows, were cracked.
It was a season of terror.
No one was injured, but 6 people have been convicted. And the judge called this man, Marvin Horan, the leader of a conspiracy, and sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison.
Marvin Horan was a preacher, former truck driver, and one of the leaders of the anti-book crusade.
Mr. Horan is out on bail pending appeal and sticking to his preaching. But he did warn that if he went to prison, the valley would be in an uproar.
After Horan's conviction, even more unsavory characters showed up in Kanawha County.
He has also drawn sympathetic support from the Grand Dragon of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Dale Roush.
Fellow Klansmen, Klans ladies, please robe up. Approach the cross for lighting.
I was struck by the images of the KKK. Kind of shocking to see.
Cece would not have known this, but those of us in the black community, the KKK was everywhere, and they were always part of the underlying difficulty of folks moving beyond being conservatives in terms of social issues.
The communist in this nation has infiltrated the educational system and to destroy the morals of our children here in this great country. The Klan stands ready. The Klan is ready to fight.
While working on this episode, we looked through an old box filled with Morley Safer's research and found some reflections. There were notes, for example, from conversations with Nell Woods, the teacher who helped select the new, more inclusive books. Woods told the 60 Minutes team that in Kanawha County, quote, fear had taken over, and we've lost the spirit of education. Protesters, she said, had attacked her patriotism.
I think we'd better understand that there is another group that's feeling very much in the minority, and that's the minority of the educational profession. And I am feeling very much these days that I am oppressed and I am abused and my rights have been violated and that I am being victimized in a society that has decided to make me an enemy when I'm not an enemy.
Ultimately, the Kanawha County School Board built a fragile consensus. Nearly all of the 325 books on trial were introduced into the schools, but only on a limited basis.
What is going on is a compromise. The school board, thrashing around, decreed that students may not use certain books unless their parents gave them written permission, and that if a parent does not want a child to read a certain book, any book, the teacher must abide by the parent's wish. Theoretically, it could paralyze education in Kanawha County. Some think it already has. The practical effect has been that thousands of books have been banned in Charleston.
Morley Safer and his team visited Kanawha County after the rages over the new books had mostly subsided, but the tensions and the underlying conflict still reverberate today.
The infrastructures that they were building in 1974 are the well-oiled, well-established, well-funded infrastructures that are motoring book bans right now.
Coming up on 60 Minutes, a second look.
Why are we still talking about Alice Moore 50 years later?
I think one of the important things about it is who came to her aid and who learned from her and this uprising in Kanawha County as much as she learned from them. If you think back into the 50s and 60s, you had these fears about what education was and is and could be.
This is Carol Mason, a professor of the humanities at the University of Kentucky.
I wrote a book called Reading Appalachia, From Left to Right, the 1974 Textbook Controversy and Conservatives. And I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia during the time of the textbook controversy.
Although Mason grew up in Kanawha County, she did not link her academic research to her hometown until she began to study modern conservative activism in the United States.
You're talking about this textbook controversy in 1974 and 5 as both a case study and a sort of cultural shift.
I think what it did was it consolidated how different parts of the right-wing ecosystem in the U.S. decided how they were going to talk about different things. It helped them crystallize their talking points and their discourse.
What was happening in the country at the time?
The sort of national context for the textbook controversy was right at the end of the American War in Vietnam. And we were also in the midst of Watergate. I think it was August of 1974 when Richard Nixon resigned. So to say that the textbook controversy, happened during a time of increased distrust in the government, I think is a really safe assumption.
And at the time, white evangelical Christians were beginning to change their approach to electoral politics.
A lot of evangelicals sort of felt like you don't get involved in politics. You don't get involved in local politics because that's something that is too worldly. It's our job as evangelicals to witness our faith and to prepare for the end times or to prepare for the way of the Lord.
But the sweeping social change of the 60s and 70s around gay rights, women's rights, and civil rights activated evangelicals. For example, just a year before the fight in Kanawha County, the Supreme Court handed down its 1973 ruling in Roe v. Wade, guaranteeing a constitutional right to abortion, a decision that galvanized the Christian right. And Republican politicians began tailoring their message to appeal to white religious conservatives.
And so we're at a historical moment there where a lot of evangelicals are starting to realize that they do want to be involved in politics and that kind of mobilization of evangelicals will go on and have a profound effect on our electoral system and will result basically in the Reagan Revolution.
The fierce, violent fight in West Virginia demonstrated how to recruit communities to support conservative political goals. With a movement led by parents, their battleground was now public education, and it was their goal to save their children from, in their view, immoral values.
The evangelicals who ultimately become the Christian right, what happened was that this helped crystallize their rationales for becoming involved in politics.
You make a lot out of this case. It seems like one small town issue. There are a lot of these issues.
And so that's what I'm saying. I'm saying you have to see it in the historical trajectory.
To understand that trajectory, it helps to know a little more about the evangelical woman at the center of the fight in Kanawha County. You'll remember Alice Moore.
Morley Safer introduces her in the story as a member of the school board. Was she just a concerned parent?
I think that her concerns were absolutely legitimate, but I also think that she was influenced by outsiders, and very often she would just repeat the talking points that she received from other organizations. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were lots of moms, there were lots of women conservatives who were politically active.
They were charismatic leaders, including Phyllis Schlafly, who by 1974 was in the midst of her battle to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment, a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that sought to guarantee legal protections for all people regardless of sex. Another activist, Anita Bryant, was about to embark on a campaign she called Save Our Children, aimed at repealing an anti-discrimination law passed in Florida to protect gay rights.
Historians have called them various things: mothers of conservatism, or kitchen table activists, housewife populists, or suburban warriors. These women who were very networked, and they had their newsletters, they had coffee clutches. I think what we see in the trajectory of the Kanawha County textbook controversy is conservatives learning how not to play the race card, but how to play the mommy card.
What does that mean?
It means that at the beginning, in 1974, when objections to the books were first laid out, a lot of the objections were based on race. And I think that gets dropped out a lot. And what I saw when I looked at the arguments against the books is that over time, those race-based arguments gave way to more of the arguments of, like, we're saving our children.
This reminded us of another 60 Minutes story from 1980. Mike Wallace profiled the impact of a conservative Texas couple who ran an influential nonprofit that helped shape what kids could read in school, not just in Texas, but all over the country.
Her name is Norma Gabler, and she is formidable. She has been called education's public enemy #1. Who is she? Well, she is simply a housewife, the mother of 3 sons, and a grandmother, too. And though she's never gone to college, when Norma Gabler speaks, the education establishment of the state of Texas listens. She and her husband, Mel, have embarked on a kind of crusade, warning parents all across America to watch out for what's in their children's textbooks.
From their home in Texas, Norma and Mel Gabler reviewed textbooks, lobbied legislators, and campaigned to get books they found offensive removed from schools. In the end, they forced publishers to label evolution a theory and define marriage as a union between a man and a woman.
These changes, made just to please the Gablers in Texas, will wind up in those textbooks all across the nation because it's too expensive to put out more than one edition.
Every child should not have to sit in the classroom and read profanity and gutter language. You have an opportunity to read the textbooks. Go to Austin and tell them what you don't want in the books. It's your money, it's your children, and you have that right.
We found a connection between Morley Safer's piece in 1975 and a piece Mike Wallace did 5 years later in 1980.
Oh, yeah.
Just take a listen to something Norma Gabler told Mike Wallace in a part of the interview that was never broadcast.
I want to share with you one other thing. I know you've heard a lot about West Virginia. A lot has been written about it. Probably I could tell you a different story because we visited with the parents.
There it was. We visited with the parents, those parents in Kanawha County. That connection is something Carol Mason from the University of Kentucky had also discovered in her research.
Alice Moore had written to the Gablers. She knew of them as textbook evaluators who were not professionals, but who were parents. The Gablers had come up to Kanawha County themselves. So I think that it just sort of supports the idea that Alice Moore was working in a sort of ecosystem of conservative networks.
It was not just the Gablers who influenced Moore's campaign. Here's podcast producer Julie Holstein again.
The other thing I found in Morley Safer's story file from Book Ban Story is this flyer. It says National Textbook Rally, Saturday, November 30th, Charleston Civic Center.
Special out-of-town speakers include, they list a couple of attorneys. The second one listed is attorney Jim McKenna, Heritage Foundation, Washington, D.C.
This was a huge rally. Thousands of people, I think, showed up.
The Heritage Foundation is now one of the most prominent conservative think tanks in the United States. In the headlines this year is the architects behind Project 2025, a roadmap that attempts to define the agenda for Republican leaders. In 1974, the Heritage Foundation was less than a year old.
The Heritage Foundation was just starting out, and they sent a variety of different representatives to Kanawha County, and they did some training sessions for them.
Heritage Foundation lawyer James McKenna not only spoke at a protest rally, he also represented a number of protesters, including Marvin Horan, the man responsible for bombing that school in West Virginia. McKenna's legal counsel was offered pro bono, but Carol Mason says that the Heritage Foundation gained a lot by donating its time.
I think they looked at what was happening in Kanawha County and tried to replicate that on a national stage. The Heritage Foundation upheld Alice Moore as a concerned mom, and a woman by the name of Connie Marshner, who was a DC-based Heritage Foundation maven, actually wrote a book called Blackboard Tyranny and upheld the conflict in Kanawha County as a way that other communities could organize parents' rights. The Heritage Foundation was in its infancy in 1974, and now it has grown up, and it is much more influential, but it's still sort of playing the same cards. You can really draw a bright red line from 74 to 2024.
Coming up on 60 Minutes, a second look.
Everybody on all sides always agreed that this was bigger than books. That's what they said in 1975, and that's what they said in 2023 and 2024.
What we set out to do with this podcast was to look back through the archives of 60 Minutes and to uncover threads and draw connections that may not have been evident when the stories were first reported. Take a listen to this story from 2024, 50 years after Morley Safer went to West Virginia. This is Scott Pelley reporting from Buford, South Carolina.
When two people demanded the banning of 97 books, Buford found itself in a battle over the true meaning of liberty.
Scott Pelley's producer, Henry Schuster, had been following the events in Buford from the very beginning.
If you would ask me when I moved to Buford, South Carolina in 2017, what my first story from Buford might be, I would have said it might be about Reconstruction and race relations. It might be about climate change, because I live in a county that during high tide is 60% underwater. It would not have been about books.
But here you are in the middle of a heated issue.
It's a heated issue locally and nationally.
The county votes Republican and is home to many veterans who did fight for America.
The vice chair of Buford County's school board at the time was a Republican and a retired Army colonel named Dick Geyer. Here he is responding to Scott Pelley, explaining how the fight began.
We got a email from a citizen saying that these 97 books that we've heard about online that should be banned in the school, how many of those books do you have in your school? So we checked. We had virtually all those books in the school.
Some of the books on this list are very familiar. Handmaid's Tale, The Art of Racing in the Rain, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl.
They're mostly young adult novels with minority, gay, lesbian, or transgender characters. Some depict sex and violence. Most were in high school libraries. 4 were in classroom curricula.
The 60 Minutes team tracked down the parent who originally complained about the books. She agreed to talk with them on background, but did not want to participate on camera.
Turns out that a friend of hers had warned her that there might be some books with bad content in the Buford school system, and she sent her a list of a few books. Being a parent, she had access to the school library circulation system, which is online. And she was told about this website called booklooks.org.
Scott Pelley explained the origins of that site in the story.
A book review website called Booklooks, founded 2 years ago by a Florida nurse. She declined an interview but told us her book reviews are written by volunteers using Booklooks' own standards.
They have a rating system of 0 to 5. And 0 is for everyone, content is appropriate for all ages. 5, aberrant content, adults only.
The mother in Buford decided to see whether the school district carried any books that were rated 3 or higher on the Booklook site.
She found 96 books. So she wrote a letter to the school superintendent and said, I have serious concerns about these 96 books. I think they should be pulled off the shelves. Somebody that she knew who was a former office holder and a guy with a podcast and a blog threw in one more book that wasn't on the list. And so they sent that list of 97 books to the school superintendent saying, this has got to go. Now, there had already been a few people speaking out about the issue of books at school board meetings. And they were saying, this is pornography, this needs to be out of our schools.
Here's Beaufort County School Board Vice Chair Dick Geyer.
We've had a parent come in and tell a librarian that you are violating a state statute by providing pornography to a minor. I'm going to the sheriff. I'm going to have you arrested and storm out. Now, that's not just happened once. That's happened multiple times at multiple schools. I even got an email saying, okay, the sheriff has said no, the solicitor said no, I'm going to the FBI.
The real question, and this is a question that goes back to 1975 versus now, is it grassroots, or to use another term, is it astroturf? In other words, is it top down or is it bottom up?
When 60 Minutes investigated, they discovered that the founder of that Booklooks review website the Buford parents had been using had ties to a conservative organization based in Florida.
She had been part of a group called Moms for Liberty. And Moms for Liberty is a group whose name that we kept hearing.
Moms for Liberty was founded during the pandemic to protest mask mandates.
If someone is demonstrably harming our children, we are going to come together to fight to protect them.
This is Tiffany Justice, one of the founders of Moms for Liberty. Scott Pelley interviewed her alongside one of her co-founders, Tina Deskovich.
We love teachers. My children have had the best teachers. I've had the greatest teachers that have influenced and impacted me. But there are rogue teachers in America's classrooms right now.
Rogue teachers.
Rogue teachers.
Parents send their children to school to be educated, not indoctrinated into ideology.
What ideology are they being indoctrinated into?
Let's just say, children in America cannot read.
This may sound familiar. Remember Alice Moore?
Stay out of the moral questions, stay out of the parent-child relationship, stay out of the psychoanalyzing of children in the classroom, get back to teaching children reading and writing and arithmetic when the schools are doing a pathetic job at that these days.
Alice Moore passed away in 2023. Marvin Horan, the man convicted of bombing the Kanawha County School, died in 2021. But there's a common thread tying their opposition to controversial books in the 1970s to Moms for Liberty today.
Let me ask you about one of the groups that's come up in previous stories. Do you know if the Heritage Foundation is involved in book banning today?
The Heritage Foundation is absolutely involved, and they're involved in a couple of different ways. Most importantly, they're involved because they have helped birth the tremendous growth of Moms for Liberty.
We did contact the Heritage Foundation to get their perspective on what we're presenting in this podcast. Jay Green, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Center for Education Policy, responded by email, writing that he believes our episode is based on a, quote, demonstrably false premise, and that the claim that there is a widespread problem of book banning in schools is inconsistent with the common usage of the term book banning. and is inconsistent with the facts of what's happening in school libraries. He went on to write that, quote, a better word to describe what school libraries are doing would be curation. They're deciding what books are both educationally and age-appropriate for inclusion in the school library, end quote. Green did not comment on the Heritage Foundation's support of Moms for Liberty.
They're challenging, they say, a system that promotes permissiveness, that questions the traditional values and ideas of this country, and above all, does not really teach our children very well.
It was ever thus. Everything old is new again.
That was producer Henry Schuster's reaction after he watched Morley Safer's story from 1975.
I can keep going with the cliches, but we've been here before. And in some cases, the similarities are just so striking that you feel that could have been done yesterday. Everybody on all sides always agreed that this was bigger than books. This was about more than books. That's what they said in 1975, and that's what they said in 2023 and 2024.
Buford, South Carolina saw a much different outcome to the Battle of the Books compared with Kanawha County.
The town asked volunteers to actually read the books. In meetings that looked like book clubs, over the course of a year, 146 community volunteers, plus teachers and librarians, discussed, deliberated, and voted.
And Professor Carol Mason sees this deliberative, community-led process as a potential model.
I was very impressed with what they did, by saying, okay, they called their bluff. All right, here are the books. Have the parents come and look at them. I thought that was great and very effective.
Ultimately, Buford confronted fear and ignorance with civility and knowledge. The final votes came this past December. 5 books were judged too graphic in sex or violence, but 92 returned to the schools.
In June 2024, however, the South Carolina Board of Education put in place a new regulation banning books that include descriptions or depictions of, quote, sexual content from any public school in the state. The regulation gives the state, not the local school boards like Buford counties, the final say on what can be included in school libraries. And the culture war over books continues to play out in Kanawha County, West Virginia, too. This year, Republicans in the state passed a piece of legislation in the lower house which would open librarians, educators, and museum staff to criminal prosecution over what might be deemed, quote, obscene material. Marian Alston and Cece Brown, who are both still in Kanawha County, have this perspective 50 years later.
Textbooks and words don't necessarily indoctrinate, and the most influence that students have are their parents and their peers. And so textbooks in and of themselves aren't evil.
When you become fearful, your emotions get involved. I was telling Marian I thought it was kind of a playbook, because I see the same playbook now. Misinformation, creating a sense of fear. You see that again, the same thing happening today, because it worked. It worked.
Morley Safer summed it all up in 1975 with a reflection that's just as relevant today.
The real issue, it can be fairly stated, is not the textbooks or the schools or who controls them. The real issue down in Kanawha County is the crisis of values in American life everywhere. The very essence of what we are and what we want to be is being contested. And this country's most precious resource, its children, are the stakes. Well, when a debate of that nature begins, reason seems to be the first casualty, and the darker side of ourselves finds its voice.
This episode of 60 Minutes, A Second Look, was co-produced by Julie Holstein, Maura Waltz, and Hazel Mae Bryant. Jamie Benson is our senior producer and engineer. Our fact-checker is Annie Cronenberg. Recording assistance from Alan Pang and Marlon Polycarp. Bill Owens is the executive producer of 60 Minutes, and Matthew Polivoy is the senior producer. Invaluable support from Megan Marcus and Steve Razies of Paramount Audio. Joseph Wershba produced the original 1975 broadcast story for 60 Minutes entitled Who Runs the Schools? Henry Schuster produced 97 Books, which was broadcast earlier this year. Thanks also to the crews and editors of the original pieces. Special thanks to audio engineer Molly Bourne, Kyle Vass at the West Virginia ACLU, Reverend Winton Hill, and Reverend Jim Lewis. I'm Seth Doan. Join us every Tuesday for a new episode of 60 Minutes, A Second Look. And if you like this episode, be sure to follow us and leave a review on your preferred podcast app. Thanks for listening.